Hello and welcome to another episode of Nerd Shit. Basically where I take the ideas surrounding science, especially in regard to health and fitness, and I break it down into the most simplest way possible that you can understand it so you can apply it to your own training, diet, whatever the case may be. I think it's important that we do this because there is a lot of myths and misconceptions when it comes to anything regarding fitness, whether you should eat a certain food, whether you should not eat a certain food, whether you should train a certain way, and things along those lines. So, for these next 3 episodes, what we're going to talk about is the macronutrients. I think it's important for the most basic level of understanding that people actually understand what they are, their role in the body, and for the most part, why you shouldn't really be fearing them and why you should include them to a certain degree within your diet. Everyone's going to be different, as you'll see it at the end of the videos when I talk about, I guess the who's and the what's should be, including them in the amounts that they should include them in. But for the most part, I think you'll leave this talk having a greater understanding of these different types of foods. So, there are 4 macronutrients. One we're going to omit because it's not even, relevant to talk about it, which is alcohol. There's carbohydrates, there's proteins, and there's fats, also known as lipids. So, they're called macronutrients is because they're going to make up, in terms of volume, a bulk of your diet. And, the volume of each one and the magnitude of each one is going to vary from person to person, depending on your goals, your lifestyle, any type of pathology or comorbidity you may have. Whatever, for the most part, is just going to make up a whole lot of your diet. Carbohydrates have been, I guess you could say, shined on from this negative light or negative lens, so to speak, because lately it's been under attack. Like, carbs are inherently fattening, they're bad for you, they'll rob you of your health. I can't tell you how many parties that I've been through, because I have a lot of Asian friends, where they said, oh, I eat too much rice, I eat too much this, I eat too much that. Like, you just eat too much in general. Not to be mean, but you just eat too much. It's the calories that is fattening. So, obviously, carbs per gram carries 4 calories, protein per gram carries 4 calories, and fat per gram carries 9 calories. And at the end of the day, how much weight you gain or do not gain, or how much weight you lose, depends on how much calories you eat and how many calories you burn. There's one fundamental truth I hope you leave from this, it's that. So whether the composition of your diet is exclusively all 100% carbohydrates, regardless, if you are in a caloric deficit, you will lose weight. Now, I don't know how health promoting that diet is. There are diets that literally are like that, like, fruitarians. These are vegan based diets where you exclusively eat fruit, because like I said, there's just like a ton of diets nowadays. But for the most part, you're probably going to be missing a lot of other key nutrients that you would get from eating, like fats and other animal-based products, or proteins, from legumes and other sources as well. So, carbohydrates. There are basically 3 types of carbohydrates. There are monosaccharides, as the name denotes. There's one basically sugar molecule, oligosaccharides, and polysaccharides. So polysaccharides are going to be more of your starch and your fibers. These are going to be the things found in whole grains, rice, potatoes, and things along those lines. Oligosaccharides are going to be things like lactose, which are found in milk. And then monosaccharides are basically going to be the things that, eventually will be broken down and in your body. Very rarely do these things appear in nature outside of a process setting in isolation. So you're never going to eat a food that's exclusively glucose besides glucose tablets, which are basically man-made. You're never going to find fructose in nature. You will find foods that have higher percentages of glucose to fructose, have higher percentages of fructose to glucose, like honey and things along those lines. However, like I said, for the most part, they rarely, appear in nature in isolation. So those are the 3 types of carbohydrates. So no matter what you hear, like, oh, natural sugar versus fake sugar, when you consume carbohydrates, it goes through this process. The digestion of carbohydrates begins in the mouth. Obviously, with mastication, you are breaking down the food to basically be further digested in the stomach, but for the most part, through mastication, you are, basically breaking down, tearing apart those foods. Secondly, there are enzymes within the saliva that break down starches. These are amylase enzymes that are going to start the process of breaking down those sugar molecules. It'll make its way down the esophagus, also known as the alimentary canal, into the stomach, where through the 3 layers, this circular motion is going to occur and turn this into this paste-like substance called chyme. And basically that chyme will make its way through the pyloric sphincter in a very pulsatile manner. It's going to be slow and controlled into the small intestine, where the final pathway for carbohydrate digestion will occur. And that's because there's the enzymes needed to further break down these carbohydrates. But obviously, once it becomes a paste, now it's ready to enter the small intestine, and this is where it's basically going to be the final destination. So once it reaches here, it's going to become glucose. So whether it's real sugar, fake sugar, whether it's bread, whether it's an apple, it's eventually going to become glucose. It does become fructose, where then it's transported to the liver and converted into glucose. For the most part, no matter what carbohydrate you eat, that's what's going to happen. So when you hear somebody say, oh, fake sugar versus real sugar, clean carbohydrates versus bad carbohydrates, which we'll talk about a little further down the road, but it's going to become glucose. So once these carbohydrates are broken down, what happens to them? Well, it basically has 3 fates. It's either going to be used as a fuel substrate to produce ATP. It's going to be used it's going to become energy, so your body can fuel your systems and everything else. It's going to be stored as glycogen. Glycogen is also a polysaccharide. Very, very long chains of carbohydrates strung together, which is stored within the liver and the muscle, or it'll be converted into fat and stored in the adipocyte later for energy. So it's either going to be stored or it's either going to be used as energy. That's the fate of the carbohydrates. So with that being said, a lot of things really dictate the type of fate that's going to occur. If you're somebody who is very physically active, you're training, you're predominantly going to be using it as fuel. Glycogen synthesis predominantly happens post-workout, and that's because glycogen synthesis and everything else is at its peak post-workout. So these are usually when these things are going to occur, and your body is constantly going through this process of taking fat in and out of the cell and using it for energy. It just depends on what the demands are. Particularly if you're somebody who's in a caloric deficit, the demand will be greater than the supply, so the net will be a weight loss. So why would you want to include carbohydrates into your diet? Well, first and foremost, and most importantly when we're talking about physiological mechanisms, it's a primary fuel source for the nervous system and the brain. The brain predominantly loves glucose. It can run on ketones, but it's not a preferred fuel source. It much rather have glucose as an immediate energy source. Some people claim they do better on ketones and all these other things. I obviously believe it's a placebo effect that they're feeling. There's a lot of other factors in it too as well. Especially people who follow a keto diet tend to be redlined on caffeine and other stimulants and nootropics. So it's hard to say which one they actually feel better on. That being said, I don't want to be dismissive. Let's not get too off topic. Let's just leave it at the fact that the brain loves glucose. Number 2, glucose is extremely important for performance. When you're training at high intensities, your body is basically going to go through the process of glycolysis, where you have 2 types. You have anaerobic glycolysis and aerobic glycolysis. Aerobic glycolysis is going to be more for like very long-term turnover. These are going to be for activities that last longer than 2 minutes. Anaerobic glycolysis is going to be things that are going to be like anywhere from 30 to 2 minutes, and obviously anaerobic means without oxygen. That's because there's not enough oxygen to basically attach to the downstream metabolites, and lactic acid is produced. So for ATP, CP, it's not necessarily important because you're obviously using creatine phosphate as an energy source. Regardless, it's going to be extremely important for fueling activity, especially high intensity activities. A lot of people think that these fat scorching workouts where their heart rate is very elevated is predominantly using fat as a fuel substrate, but this is actually the opposite. Your body uses fat predominantly at lower intensities, and it prefers glucose at higher intensities because glucose will yield a greater ATP production per gram. Lastly, it is a protein sparer. So what does this mean? So basically, protein's most functional role in the body is to be used to repair tissues within the body. And obviously when you're like trying to build muscle, you want a adequate, if not super physiological amount of protein, sometimes more than what the average person will consume. This is very important when you're training very aggressively. Also, when you're dieting, because we know that when you're dieting and you have a high protein intake, it will delay the rate of muscle breakdown. That being said, if you're not supplying enough carbohydrates in your diet, your body will actually take protein, which has three products. It has an amine group, a nitrogen group, and a functional group. It'll break it down and go through the process of gluconeogenesis, where its fate will basically be converted into carbohydrates. So if you are not supplying enough carbohydrates for your, let's say daily activities, your body will leach protein, and now you'll have less protein to go towards its more functional roles. So to summarize, 3 fates: be used as energy, stored as glycogen, stored as fat, primary fuel source for the brain, primary fuel source for high intensity activities, but also it's a protein spare. That being said, the amount of carbohydrates that you are going to consume on a daily basis is going to vary from person to person, and we have to take into account a lot of things: your physical activity, what your goals are, your tolerance to those carbohydrates, which we'll talk a little bit towards the end. So obviously there is no blanketed statement that can be made about the perfect amount for everybody. That being said, if you're a performance athlete or if you're a bodybuilder who wants to improve your composition and everything else, you're probably going to want a more than adequate amount of carbohydrates. So who should probably avoid carbohydrates? People obviously with pathologies like diabetes, but I would even say not necessarily avoid, but tightly regulate the amount that they get in. I don't think you should take them out completely. I just think you should really monitor the sources that you get them from and the amount that you get them from. So, what are the best times of day to consume carbohydrates? If you're, let's say a performance athlete, obviously carbohydrates has the best utility pre-workout, because you want to have a steady level of glucose in your bloodstream to fuel your performance. If you're somebody who's training for a prolonged period of time, let's say like longer than 2 hours, it would definitely be recommended that you consume glucose during your workout. But it's extremely important that you consume carbohydrates post-workout. Like I said earlier, glycogen synthesis is at its peak following a workout, and it dwindles throughout this 24-hour window as time goes on. So if you really want to harness the fact that you're eating carbohydrates and you're using it in a very functional way, which is to replenish hepatic and muscle glycogen, it will be very important to include them post-workout. That would be the best way. And also to take advantage of that is the fact that you're very, very insulin sensitive and glucose sensitive post-workout as well. So there's these things within these cells called glucose transporters, more specifically the GLUT4 transporters that exist within the cytoplasm. They exist in sort of these cluster-like states until activated, and then when muscle contractions or insulin attaches to a cell, they translocate to basically penetrate the cell membrane to allow glucose entry into the cell. So if you're somebody who is slightly insulin resistant or you don't tolerate a lot of carbohydrates, it would be very beneficial to include them probably following a workout and emitting them prior to that. So basically, in a nutshell, that's what carbohydrates are, that's what their roles are, their functional roles in the body, and how you may or may not want to apply them. Should people avoid them altogether? No. Even if you have diabetes, you just want to make sure that you are, controlling the amount that you're getting, and obviously matching it with the times that you are, taking your insulin, metformin, whatever it may be. So, in the beginning I said real sugar, fake sugar, the fate is always going to be the same. The only caveat to that is that there's this thing called gastric emptying. Things will literally get into your small intestine much sooner, and they'll also have a more profound effect on blood glucose than other sources as well, which could be quite detrimental because obviously your body sort of wants equilibrium for the amount of glucose which is in your system because it functions on a systems of negative feedback loops. So if you do happen to eat carbohydrates and you eat them from, like, let's say a processed source where it digests very quickly, your blood glucose levels will rise extremely fast. Insulin will be released to basically normalize your blood glucose levels, and then what you'll get is a drop, which is what we call, reactive hypoglycemia. So if you're somebody who's worried about your health, but you want to include carbohydrates in your diet, it would be very beneficial to include, if you're going to eat processed, some type of buffer, and this can be fiber or protein, preferably both. When you eat fiber, what it does is slows the rate of gastric emptying, and it actually acts as a buffer to the release of glucose as well. So if you're going to have a sweet potato, maybe have some broccoli with it. If you're going to have some bread, maybe you can have something along the lines that is more fibrous with it, like a vegetable of some sort, like a carrot, or things along those lines to slow the rate of gastric emptying and that have a steady state of glucose. But that's everything in its nutshell. I think bodybuilders should consume an ample amount of carbohydrates. I think performance athletes should consume an ample amount of carbohydrates. I think people who have fat loss and weight loss goals should consume an adequate amount of carbohydrates, but as we're bringing, the calories down, probably I would pull from carbohydrates before everything else, because there is no essential carbohydrates. There are essential proteins, essential amino acids, and there are essential fatty acids. So we want to make sure that we are not shooting ourselves in the foot and sacrificing our health. It's probably going to be the safest to bring the carbohydrates down first. But anyways, that's your nerd shit talk for today. Kind of all over the place, but I hope you learned something. Take care for the next talk where we talk about fat. See you soon.